Marcus Williams had always been the kind of man who believed strength could solve anything. Standing 6 feet tall with muscles that showed years of hard work at the construction site, he walked through life thinking nobody could match his power. His friends knew him as the guy who never backed down from a fight, who could lift twice his weight, and who had never met a challenge he couldn't handle with his bare hands. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Marcus was walking home from the local gym, his workout bag slung over his shoulder, when he decided to take a shortcut through the tourist area near the Royal Palace. The streets were busy with visitors taking pictures and guides explaining the history of the old buildings. Marcus barely paid attention to any of it. He had more important things on his mind, like the argument he'd had with his boss that morning about overtime pay. As he walked past the palace gates, something caught his eye. There, standing perfectly still like a statue, was a royal guard. The man wore a tall black hat, a bright red uniform with shiny buttons, and held a rifle at his side. His face showed no expression at all. Tourists were gathered around him, taking selfies and trying to make him smile or move. Children waved at him. Adults made funny faces. Some even tried to touch his uniform, but the guard didn't move a single muscle. Marcus stopped walking and watched this scene with growing irritation. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to stand there like a piece of furniture, letting people treat them like some kind of entertainment. In his world, if someone disrespected you, you made sure they knew about it. The whole thing seemed ridiculous to him. A group of teenagers was now trying to get the guard's attention by making loud noises and jumping around in front of him. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, completely ignoring them. Marcus shook his head in disgust. This wasn't strength or discipline in his mind. This was weakness. A real man would have put these kids in their place already. He watched for another few minutes, getting more annoyed by the second. The guard looked young, maybe in his 20s, with a clean-shaven face and perfect posture. Everything about him screamed military training, but Marcus wasn't impressed. He'd dealt with military guys before at work, and most of them were all talk once you got past the uniform and the fancy training. The crowd around the guard was getting bigger. More people were taking pictures, and some adults were now joining in with the teenagers, trying to make the guard react. They were waving, their hands in front of his face, making silly sounds, and one man even pretended to steal his hat. Through it all, the guard remained completely motionless. Marcus felt his anger building. This wasn't just about the guard anymore. It was about everything that frustrated him. People who didn't stand up for themselves. Rules that didn't make sense in a world that seemed to reward weakness over strength. He'd grown up in a rough neighborhood where respect was earned with your fists, not given because of some fancy uniform. He started walking closer to the scene, pushing through the crowd of tourists. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel his heart rate increasing, the same way it did before every fight he'd ever been in. The smart thing would have been to keep walking home, but Marcus had never been good at walking, away from things that bothered him. As he got closer, he could see the guard more clearly. The man was probably about the same height as Marcus, maybe a bit shorter. His uniform looked expensive and well-maintained, but underneath it, Marcus could see he had a lean build. Not skinny, but definitely not the kind of bulk that Marcus was used to dealing with in fights. This just made him more confident that he could handle whatever this guard had to offer. The tourists around him were laughing and having fun, completely unaware that Marcus's mood was getting darker by the second. To them, this was just entertainment, a fun part of their vacation. They had no idea that someone in the crowd was about to turn their peaceful afternoon into something much more serious. Marcus stopped just a few feet away from the guard, studying him like a predator studying its prey. The man's face was calm and professional, his breathing steady and controlled. His hands held the rifle in a perfect position, and every part of his uniform was exactly where it should be. Even up close, there wasn't the slightest hint that he was aware of Marcus's presence or intentions. This complete lack of reaction only made Marcus more determined to prove his point. In his mind, everyone had a breaking point. Everyone could be pushed far enough to lose control. He just had to find the right buttons to push, and this royal guard would crack like everyone else. What he didn't realize was that he was about to learn a lesson that would change his entire understanding of what real strength actually meant. Marcus decided to test the guard's limits. He started small, like the other tourists had done, but with a different energy behind his actions. While the families and visitors had been playful and respectful, Marcus's approach carried an edge that made some nearby people glance at him nervously. He began by walking directly in front of the guard, blocking his view, and staring straight into his eyes. The guard's gaze remained fixed on the distance, looking right through Marcus as if he wasn't there. This complete dismissal only fueled Marcus's anger. In his world, when someone ignored you like that, it meant they thought they were better than you. Moving closer, Marcus started making comments under his breath, just loud enough for the guard to hear. He criticized the uniform, called the whole ceremony a joke, and questioned whether the guard was even a real soldier. Still, there was no reaction. Not even a slight change in the guard's expression or breathing pattern. The other tourists began to notice that something was different about this interaction. A mother pulled her children a bit further away. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances. The playful atmosphere that had existed just minutes before was slowly turning tense. Marcus escalated his behavior. He waved his hands aggressively, in front of the guard's face, snapped his fingers near his ears, and made loud, mocking sounds. He walked circles around the guard, looking for any sign of annoyance or weakness. But the royal guard remained as still and composed as a mountain. What Marcus didn't understand was that this guard, James Patterson, had gone through some of the most intense training in the world. For months, he had practiced standing perfectly, still while instructors yelled at him, threw objects near him, and tested his mental strength in ways that would break most people. The tourists' playful antics were nothing compared to what he'd already endured. James had learned to enter a mental state where external distractions simply couldn't reach him. His mind was focused on his duty, his breathing was controlled, and his body had been trained to ignore discomfort and provocation. He was aware of Marcus's presence, but he viewed it the same way he would view bad weather, something unpleasant that would eventually pass. But Marcus interpreted this lack of response as proof that the guard was either scared or weak. In his experience, people only stayed quiet when they couldn't handle confrontation. He'd never encountered someone who chose not to respond from a position of strength rather than weakness. The situation took a more serious turn when Marcus decided to get physical. He started with small pushes, barely touching the guard's shoulder or arm, testing to see if he would maintain his position. When James didn't react to these minor contacts, Marcus became bolder. He pushed a bit harder, trying to make the guard step back or adjust his stance. Still nothing. The guard's feet remained planted exactly where they had been, his posture unchanged. This incredible stability only made Marcus more frustrated and more determined to get a reaction. Some tourists were now actively moving away from the scene, sensing that things were getting out of hand. Others pulled out their phones, unsure if they were about to witness something that needed to be recorded. A few people started looking around for security or police, but the area seemed strangely empty of any other authority figures. Marcus's pushes became more forceful. He was now using enough strength that it would have knocked most people off balance, but James absorbed each impact without moving an inch. His military training had included learning how to maintain position under physical pressure, and his body was like a deeply rooted tree that bends but doesn't break. What Marcus couldn't see was the incredible mental discipline this required. James wasn't just standing there taking abuse. He was actively controlling every muscle in his body, managing his breathing, and maintaining his focus, despite the increasing aggression he was facing. Every instinct he had was telling him to defend himself, but his training and professionalism were stronger than his instincts. The crowd was now clearly divided between those who were uncomfortable and moving away, and those who were staying, to watch what they hoped wouldn't turn into a serious incident. Some people were starting to whisper among themselves, wondering if someone should intervene or call for help. Marcus, however, was beyond caring about the crowd or consequences. His pride was on the line now. He'd committed to breaking this guard's composure, and backing down would feel like admitting defeat. He'd never walked away from a challenge in his life, and he wasn't about to start now, especially not in front of all these witnesses. He stepped back and looked at the guard with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. Part of him was impressed by the man's ability to absorb punishment without reacting, but his ego wouldn't let him admit that. Instead, he convinced himself that he just hadn't found the right approach yet. Marcus began planning his next move, something that would force this royal guard to abandon his professional composure and show the weakness that Marcus was convinced existed underneath the uniform. He had no idea that his next actions would lead to consequences he never could have imagined. Marcus decided it was time to stop playing games. If gentle pushing wasn't going to work, he would have to use real force. He cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, preparing for what he was sure would be a quick and easy victory. In his mind, once he applied serious pressure, this guard would either fight back or crumble completely. He positioned himself directly in front of James and placed both hands on the guard's chest. Then, using all the strength he'd built up from years of construction work, he pushed as hard as he could. The force was enough to send most men stumbling backward several steps, but James didn't move. It was like pushing against a brick wall. The guard's feet remained planted in exactly the same position, his body absorbing the impact without even swaying. Marcus felt a moment of genuine surprise, but he pushed it down and tried again, this time putting his full weight behind the push. Again, nothing. James stood there like he was rooted to the ground, his expression still calm and professional. His breathing hadn't changed, his uniform wasn't even wrinkled, and there was no sign that Marcus's efforts were causing him any difficulty at all. The tourists who remained were now clearly witnessing something beyond normal tourist behavior. Several people had their phones out, recording what was happening. Others were looking around desperately for security or police. The atmosphere had shifted from playful curiosity to genuine concern. Marcus was beginning to sweat, not from physical exertion, but from the growing realization that he might have seriously underestimated this royal guard. He'd used enough force to knock over men bigger than himself, but James hadn't budged an inch. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a flicker of doubt about his own abilities, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. He'd made his challenge public, in front of dozens of witnesses. Walking away now would be humiliating. He convinced himself that he just needed to try a different approach. Maybe the guard was bracing for forward pressure but wouldn't be ready for something from the side. Marcus moved to James's left side and tried to push him sideways. He put his shoulder into it, using leverage and technique rather than just brute strength, but the result was the same. James remained perfectly positioned, as if Marcus's efforts were no more significant than a light breeze. What Marcus didn't understand was the science behind what he was witnessing. James had been trained in advanced body mechanics and balance techniques. His stance wasn't just military posture. It was a carefully engineered position that distributed force efficiently through his entire body and down into the ground. His core muscles were engaged in ways that created incredible stability without apparent effort. Beyond the physical aspects, James's mental state was something Marcus had never encountered before. The guard had learned to separate his mind from physical discomfort and external pressure. He wasn't fighting against Marcus's pushes. He was simply maintaining his position while his body dealt with the forces being applied to it. Marcus tried several more approaches. He attempted to lift the guard, to twist him, to knock him off balance with sudden movements. Each attempt failed completely. James stood there like a statue that had been carved from solid rock, unmovable and unshakable. The crowd was now openly staring at what had become a very one-sided contest. Some people were making comments about how impressive the guard's training must be. Others were criticizing Marcus for his aggressive behavior. A few were wondering aloud whether someone should call the police. Marcus was starting to breathe heavily, not from the physical effort, but from frustration and growing embarrassment. He'd never encountered anyone who could simply ignore his strength like this. Every person he'd ever confronted had either backed down immediately or engaged in a fight. This complete neutrality was something entirely outside his experience. He stepped back and studied James more carefully, looking for some weakness or vulnerability he might have missed. The guard's uniform was still perfect, his posture unchanged, his expression as calm as when Marcus had first approached him. There was no sign of strain, no indication that the last several minutes of aggressive contact had affected him in any way. For a moment, Marcus considered the possibility that he was dealing with someone who was simply better trained and more disciplined than he was, but his ego quickly rejected this thought. He'd never met anyone stronger than himself, and he wasn't about to accept that this uniformed pretty boy could be his match. Marcus decided to escalate one more time. If physical pushing wasn't working, he would try something that the guard couldn't possibly ignore. He would do something that would force a reaction, something that would prove once and for all that everyone had a breaking point. What he didn't realize was that James had been quietly observing his behavior and had already identified Marcus as a serious threat. While maintaining his professional composure, the guard had been mentally preparing for the possibility that this situation might require him to take action. Marcus was about to discover that there's a big difference between someone who won't fight and someone who can't fight. Marcus made the decision that would change everything. Frustrated by his complete inability to move or provoke the guard, he decided to grab the man's rifle. In his anger-clouded thinking, he believed that threatening the guard's weapon would finally force a reaction. He had no idea that he was about to cross a line that would trigger a response unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The moment Marcus's hand made contact with the rifle, James moved. But it wasn't the clumsy, desperate scramble that Marcus had expected. It was like watching a machine activate, smooth, precise, and devastatingly effective. In one fluid motion, James shifted his grip on the rifle, stepped into a combat stance, and used Marcus's own forward momentum against him. Before Marcus could process what was happening, he found himself face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back, in a position that made any movement extremely painful. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Marcus, who had been so confident in his physical superiority just moments before, was now completely helpless. The guard's knee was pressed into his back, and his arm was controlled in a way that made resistance impossible without risking serious injury. The crowd of tourists gasped and stepped back. Several people had captured the moment on their phones, and the footage would later show just how effortlessly the guard had neutralized what appeared to be a much larger and stronger attacker. But James wasn't finished. With his free hand, he produced a whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts. Within seconds, the sound of running feet could be heard approaching from multiple directions. Marcus realized too late that the guard had backup, and that backup had been watching the entire encounter from concealed positions nearby. 4 additional royal guards appeared, seemingly from nowhere. They moved with the same precision and purpose that James had shown, quickly surrounding the area and establishing a secure perimeter. Their arrival was so swift and coordinated that it was clear they'd been monitoring the situation and waiting for their colleague's signal. Marcus tried to struggle, but the guard's control was absolute. Every time he attempted to move, the pressure on his arm increased just enough to remind him that resistance would only make things worse. He was forced to lie there, his face pressed against the cold pavement while tourists took pictures and made comments about what they'd just witnessed. One of the newly arrived guards stepped forward and began speaking into a radio, reporting the incident and requesting additional support. Another guard started gently moving the crowd back, ensuring that everyone was safe while maintaining space for the situation to be resolved properly. James maintained his hold on Marcus while speaking, in a calm, professional voice. He identified himself as Royal Guard Patterson and explained that Marcus was being detained for assault on a member of the Royal Guard and for attempting to interfere with official duties. His tone was completely neutral, showing no anger or satisfaction, just the facts of what had occurred. Marcus couldn't believe what was happening. In his mind, he'd been the one in control, the one making the choices about how far to push things. Now he was lying on the ground in front of dozens of strangers, completely powerless and utterly humiliated. The man he'd thought was weak and passive had turned out to be more skilled and dangerous than anyone Marcus had ever encountered. The police arrived within minutes, having been called by the guards' radio communication. They approached the scene with respect for the royal guards and took control of Marcus without any unnecessary force. As James finally released his hold, Marcus felt blood rushing back into his arm, and realized just how much control the guard had been exercising. He could have caused serious injury at any point, but had chosen to use exactly the amount of force necessary and no more. As the police helped Marcus to his feet, he got his first good look at James since the takedown had begun. The guard's uniform was still perfect, his breathing was still controlled, and his expression remained completely professional. There was no hint of triumph or satisfaction on his face, just the calm demeanor of someone who had done his job exactly as he'd been trained to do it. Marcus was read his rights and led toward the police car, his hands now cuffed behind his back. The tourists who had witnessed the entire incident were giving statements to other officers, and several people had already shared their video recordings as evidence of what had transpired. As he was placed in the back of the police car, Marcus caught one last glimpse of James, who had already returned to his post and resumed his ceremonial duties. The guard stood in exactly the same position as before, with the same perfect posture and the same calm expression. It was as if the entire incident had never happened. But for Marcus, everything had changed. The man who had walked up to that guard post thinking he could break anyone's will through force and intimidation was now facing serious criminal charges. His understanding of strength, discipline, and what it meant to be truly powerful had been shattered in less than a minute of actual confrontation. The ride to the police station gave Marcus time to think about what had just happened, and for the first time in his life he was forced to confront the possibility that he might have been completely wrong about what real strength actually looked like. The police station was a sobering place for Marcus to spend the next several hours. As he sat in the holding cell, waiting for his lawyer and processing what had happened, he had plenty of time to replay the events in his mind. Each time he thought about it, he felt a deeper sense of embarrassment and confusion about how completely wrong he'd been. The charges against him were serious. Assault on a royal guard was not treated lightly by the legal system. The prosecutor explained that he was facing potential jail time, substantial fines, and a permanent criminal record. The video evidence from multiple tourists made his case nearly impossible to defend on factual grounds. His lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Sarah Collins, was brutally honest about his situation. She explained that the best they could hope for was a plea deal that might reduce the charges in exchange for a guilty plea and some form of community service. Fighting the charges in court would likely result in a harsher sentence, given the clear evidence of his aggressive behavior. Marcus spent 3 days in jail before his bail hearing. During those 3 days, he had more time to think than he'd had in years. Away from the distractions of work, friends, and his usual routine, he was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself and his behavior. He realized that his entire approach to conflict and confrontation had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. He'd always believed that physical strength and willingness to fight were signs of power and dominance. But the Royal Guard had shown him a completely different kind of strength, one based on discipline, training, and mental control. James Patterson hadn't needed to prove anything to anyone. He hadn't been threatened by Marcus's size or aggression because he possessed something much more powerful than physical bulk. He had complete mastery over himself, the kind of inner strength that made external challenges irrelevant. When Marcus was finally released on bail, he found that his life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. The incident had been recorded by multiple people and had spread on social media. Some videos had gone viral, showing him being effortlessly taken down by the guard. Comments ranged from mocking his failed attempt at intimidation to praising the guard's professional handling of the situation. At work, his colleagues treated him differently. Some made jokes about his encounter with the Royal Guard. Others seemed genuinely disappointed in his behavior. His boss called him into the office for a serious conversation about how the incident reflected on the company, and Marcus realized that his actions might have consequences beyond just legal problems. But the most difficult part was facing his own family. His younger brother, Danny, had always looked up to Marcus as the tough guy who could handle any situation. When Danny saw the videos online, he was confused and hurt. He'd built his own identity partly around having a strong, fearless older brother, and now he didn't know what to think. Marcus's mother was more direct in her disappointment. She'd raised him to treat people with respect and to use his strength to protect others, not to bully strangers who were just doing their jobs. The conversation with her was one of the most painful experiences of his life, because he realized that he'd become someone she didn't recognize or respect. As the weeks passed while waiting for his court date, Marcus found himself thinking more and more about the Royal Guard. He researched the training that these men went through, learning about the months of physical conditioning, mental preparation, and discipline required to perform their duties. He discovered that many Royal Guards were military veterans who had served in combat situations around the world. He learned about the history and tradition behind the ceremonial duties, understanding for the first time that what he'd seen as pointless standing around was actually a position of great honor and responsibility. These guards were protecting important buildings and people, and their ability to remain focused and alert despite distractions was a crucial part of their job. Marcus also started reading about different concepts of strength and power. He discovered philosophers and warriors throughout history who had written about the importance of self-control, discipline, and mental toughness. He began to understand that the strongest people weren't necessarily those who could lift the most weight or win the most fights, but those who had complete mastery over their own actions and reactions. The plea hearing arrived faster than Marcus had expected. Standing in front of the judge, listening to the details of his case being read aloud, he felt a deep sense of shame about his behavior. When given the opportunity to speak, he surprised everyone, including his lawyer, by asking if he could address his comments directly to the Royal Guard who had been present in court as a witness. James Patterson sat in the witness section wearing his dress uniform, looking as composed and professional as he had that day at his post. When the judge granted Marcus's request, he turned to face the guard and spoke words that he'd been practicing for weeks, but still found difficult to say. Marcus looked directly at James Patterson and spoke with genuine remorse in his voice. He apologized not just for his actions, but for his complete misunderstanding of what the guard represented. He acknowledged that he had been wrong about everything, about strength, about discipline, and about what it meant to be a man worthy of respect. He explained to the court that the incident had forced him to examine his entire approach to life and relationships. He'd always believed that power came from the ability to intimidate or overpower others, but the Royal Guard had shown him that true power came from self-control, professional excellence, and the strength to remain calm under pressure. James Patterson listened to Marcus's apology with the same composed expression he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. When the judge asked if he had anything to say in response, the guard stood and spoke in a clear, measured voice. He stated that he bore no personal ill will toward Marcus, and that he hoped this experience would serve as a learning opportunity for everyone involved. The judge sentenced Marcus to 6 months of community service, a substantial fine, and mandatory anger management counseling. While the sentence was serious, it was lighter than what he might have received if he'd shown no remorse or understanding of his actions. As part of his community service, Marcus was assigned to work with a local veterans organization that helped former military personnel adjust to civilian life. The irony wasn't lost on him that his punishment involved serving the same type of people he'd tried to humiliate. Working with the veterans opened Marcus's eyes to stories of real courage and sacrifice. He met men and women who had served in dangerous situations around the world, who had shown genuine bravery in the face of actual threats. Their quiet professionalism and dedication reminded him of the qualities he'd seen in James Patterson. Through his anger management counseling, Marcus learned about the psychological patterns that had led to his confrontation with the Royal Guard. He discovered that his need to prove his dominance over others had actually been a sign of deep insecurity, not strength. The counselor helped him understand that confident people don't need to constantly test themselves against others. Over the months that followed, Marcus began to rebuild his understanding of what it meant to be strong. He started reading books about leadership, discipline, and personal development. He joined a martial arts class where he learned about the mental aspects of combat and the importance of controlling aggression rather than being controlled by it. The martial arts instructor, a former military officer, became something of a mentor to Marcus. He taught him that the most skilled fighters were often the calmest people, because they had nothing to prove to anyone. They understood that violence should always be a last resort, used only when necessary to protect themselves or others. Marcus also began to change his approach to relationships and work. Instead of trying to intimidate colleagues or dominate conversations, he started focusing on being helpful and collaborative. He discovered that people actually respected him more when he used his physical strength to assist others rather than to assert dominance. His relationship with his family slowly began to heal as well. His brother Danny, initially confused by the incident, eventually came to respect Marcus more for how he'd handled the aftermath than for his previous reputation as someone who never backed down from a fight. Their conversations became deeper and more meaningful as Marcus learned to be vulnerable about his mistakes and growth. 6 months after the incident, Marcus completed his community service and anger management program. On his last day at the Veterans Organization, several of the people he'd worked with told him that his genuine desire to help and learn had made a real difference in their programs. As he walked home that evening, Marcus found himself passing by the same Royal Guard post where everything had started. A different guard was on duty now, but the scene was familiar. Tourists taking pictures, children waving, people trying to get reactions. Marcus stopped and watched for a few minutes, seeing the situation completely differently than he had before. He understood now that the guard's stillness wasn't weakness or fear, but a demonstration of incredible mental and physical discipline. The man was performing a duty that required skills Marcus had never possessed, and was doing it with a level of professionalism that deserved respect, not mockery. Marcus never saw James Patterson again, but he often thought about the lesson the Royal Guard had taught him in those few seconds of perfectly controlled action. He'd learned that real strength wasn't about how much you could lift or how many fights you could win. It was about having complete control over yourself, about being able to remain calm and focused regardless of what others were trying to do to you. The incident that had started as Marcus trying to prove his dominance over someone he saw as weak had ended with him discovering what genuine strength actually looked like. The Royal Guard hadn't needed to humiliate or embarrass him. Marcus had done that to himself through his own actions. But in the process, he'd learned the most valuable lesson of his life about what it truly meant to be powerful.